But the harsh reality is that Ukraine is in no way ready for that. And most political commentators say that Russia, President Putin, he's not going to negotiate if he thinks there's any chance of a change of administration at the US presidential elections, because he's going to wait till after that, because if there is a dip in US support, that will be a great catalyst for him to just get involved.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to episode 2 of Red Matrix. Sean, it's been a really interesting week.
It's been a fascinating week, Bern. The war in Israel has been dominating the news. And yet for the first time in actually a month, I actually did an interview about Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is still going ferociously. And therefore, we're going to cover both those topics this week. Looking forward to getting into it.
Let's get going. So, Sean, it's been almost a month and the spotlight is still off Zelensky. The cameras have moved somewhere else. How's he feeling? The politics are changing potentially, but we're not being told. What's happening?
It's been a strange month, hasn't it? We went from Ukraine being centre stage, and then 7th of October happened almost overnight. It stopped. I do quite a lot of media interviews, and I've only done one since that time about Ukraine. And yet the war rumbles on. President Zelensky, of course, was very good at harnessing that world media attention. He was going to visit international leaders. Every time he had a photo call, whether it's US, the UK, Germany, France, they would always use that as an opportunity to donate more support and aid. So it was undoubtedly a huge way of gaining that support. But of course now, media spotlight's gone. And worse, we've seen in the media already in the last couple of weeks, the US has diverted some military aid, 155 millimeter shells that were due to go to Ukraine, are now going to Israel. On the positive side, US aid is still flowing. I think there was 120 odd million pounds worth of weapons that's once again been approved. But the downside is there's been a new speaker now. I think his name is Mike Johnson, who has been elected. He's against continuing aid for Ukraine, and therefore, and you got to remember, the US is one of the major donors here. It's not like just one person not contributing. That would have a huge impact. The other things that are interesting in noting is that if the West's support for military aid to Ukraine atrophies at all, North Korea, remember the conversations that Putin and the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un were having? It now appears that there's been 1,000 ISA containers of weapons have been moved across from North Korea to Russia. Apparently 1 million rounds of artillery. Now, whilst Russia denies it's happening, North Korea denies it's happening, it's pretty clear it is. Now, it sounds a lot of artillery. It's about 1 month's utilization rate for Russia. But that axis of evil is a little bit of a worry. And the other dynamic here is that the Ukraine's commander-in-chief, Valery Zaluzhny, he's been interviewed recently, written a paper, and he talks about this new phase of the war, which is much more static. And that's prompted a lot of media commentators to go, does he mean it's stalled? Is this stopped it for some reason? A bit like, and he used the analogy of World War I, the trench warfare. And of course, if that is true, that would potentially lead people to look at whether it's time for a negotiation and compromise. But the harsh reality is that Ukraine is in no way ready for that. And most political commentators say that Russia, President Putin, he's not going to negotiate if he thinks there's any chance of a change of administration at the US presidential elections, because he's going to wait till after that, because if there is a dip in US support, that will be a great catalyst for him to just get involved. So President Zelensky, in short, is going to be hoping that the Israeli conflict doesn't go on and on, because he absolutely can't afford a declining support for Ukraine. But whatever happens, we're now seeing, the West has got its own domestic priorities. Israel could well be a protracted conflict. None of that provides a really solid foundation for Ukraine going forward, and that must be a great worry for President Zelensky.
The Ukraine spring offensive feels like yesterday. Actually, it was 5 months ago. Since then, we've been through summer. We're moving into winter. It's a mud bath. Last week, you said things were going to change military on the ground. Things become very difficult. How is it actually shaping up?
Yeah, it's we called it a spring offensive. It didn't start till June in the end. But as you say, 5 months in. Now, arguably, Ukraine could not have been better prepared for that offensive. It got weapons from the West. It got financial support from the West. It had training from the West, ammunition from the West. But the winter rains have now arrived. So the whole of the battlefield is now a mud bath. You can't do maneuver warfare anymore at the moment. And it won't be till November, December time before the weather changes again and it all freezes over. That allows the armour to move again. And bluntly, we haven't actually seen that much movement on the front line. What has been interesting, though, in the last week particularly, is Russia is still throwing troops at Avdiivka, which is up near Bakhmut, and it's part of that whole fight for Bakhmut in the east of the country. But Russia is just suffering absolutely huge casualties. They're not properly trained personnel. They're using Storm Z, they're calling them, assault troops, which are largely prisoners. Do you remember that, the Wagner group was recruiting prisoners? Now the Wagner group's gone. The Russian military are doing the same, and they're calling them meat assaults. Basically, it's a meat grinder, and
meat being people.
And because they're not properly supported, these troops, they haven't been properly trained, they're not coordinating artillery. Apparently, some of these forces are suffering between 40 and 70% loss rates on the battlefield.
And what does that turn into in numbers terms?
Well, the UK MOD, there's regular assessments of how many the total casualties, and of course, it's very difficult to be very accurate. But the UK MOD is now saying they believe there are 300,000 Russian casualties so far since the start of this war. They believe 100,000 dead, and of the 200,000 that are injured, half of those, 100,000, are life-changing injuries. And if you just imagine back from our, Afghanistan model, when we sort of lost hundreds rather than thousands, the Help for Heroes was extremely busy dealing with all these young men and some women coming home without limbs, life-changing injuries. And of course, Russia, millions have fled Russia to avoid the draft. Now they're going to have these huge numbers that are badly impacted by their war. And it's getting worse. The trouble is, the reports, because the morale is so low of some of these Russian soldiers, they've got barricade forces now in place, which are Russian forces behind the Russian forces on the front line. They have one instruction: if the Russian forces turn to run away, you shoot them.
Yeah.
How outrageous is that? Now, on the other side, there's also Russian who've not been famous about using technology. We've seen them using their Lancet kamikaze drones for the first time in the last few days. These are autonomous drones. They find their target, loiter for a bit, and then attack.
And blow themselves up.
Yeah, but they've got quite a small charge. It's only 3 to 5 kilograms of charge. So it's not going to do significant damage to major targets.
It's disruptive, though.
But very disruptive. And also, if you swarm them, they can overwhelm defences. But going back to the fact that the fighting, 20 months in now to this 2-year war, there's no breakthrough. The casualties are rising. The front line is frankly looking very static, and it doesn't look likely, even though it's going to be fighting over the winter, we're probably not going to see much movement until springtime. And that must be a major concern for President Zelensky.
And body bags arriving back home in the tens of thousands, and injuries that people probably will have never seen before. Injuries from war, I know because I've seen them, are horrific. The impact on society and the inability to control the news is going to be interesting.
It is, and that's gradually a tsunami that's hitting. And Russia is not famous for looking after its injured soldiers. We weren't that good at it. That's why Help for Heroes kicked in. But as a society, I think we've done quite a lot to look after it. I'm not so sure the same will be in Russia, and that will breed another level of frustration as well.
Turning to Israel-Hamas, last time we spoke, we postulated that a ground offensive was going to be tough, and so tough it might not happen. It's happened. So, what changed?
Yeah, we definitely, I think a lot of the world's press got this wrong, really. It's interesting because at the time, there was a poll done of Israeli population, and only 29% were in favour of actually doing a ground offensive. At the time, if you do a ground offensive, what's it going to achieve? Because it's all very well saying you destroy Hamas, but it's going to be very difficult to do. Likewise, there were 1,400 Israeli deaths on that fateful day of the 7th of October. But at the time, there were 7,500 Palestinian deaths as a result, and the humanitarian situation in the Gaza was spiraling out of control. And most military commentators on the 27th of October, when Prime Minister Netanyahu and his main military colleagues stood up to do a press conference, I think a lot of us thought this would be the beginning of the end. There will be a magnanimous gesture. The West has seen these conflicts bubble up regularly in the Middle East, and with a bit of diplomatic pressure that they sort of settle down. How wrong we were, because at that press conference, Prime Minister Netanyahu made very clear that he was declaring war on Hamas. He was going to solve the Hamas problem, whatever it took, however long it took. And that was a completely different tone, a completely different approach to the whole conflict. And now what looks likely, therefore, what that means is that they can't clear the whole of Gaza. So they've got rid of the Gazans out of the north of Gaza into the south of Gaza. And they're going to now take over the whole of northern Gaza. Once they've obliterated everybody from Hamas, they'll then probably hand it back to the Palestinian authorities with some sort of security guarantees and then leave. But my goodness, how on earth are they actually going to do that? And what declaring war means, that has profound implications for the rest of this campaign.
And do you think it's actually possible to evacuate Hamas in its entirety? That sounds like a great ambition if you're Netanyahu, but actually practically quite difficult.
So you could get rid of its infrastructure, its offices, its buildings, potentially you can target its leadership. Potentially you can get rid of a lot of its weapon stores if you know where they are. But actually the danger is that if Hamas is appealing to certain elements of the Palestinian occupants of the Gaza Strip, we don't understand in the West, but the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, there's 50% unemployment rate. Where the rest of the world over the last 20 years has seen a steady increase in our quality of life and living standards, that has deteriorated throughout that time for those living in Gaza. They're in an open prison, prospects are poor, and in those sorts of environments, then people like Hamas do offer an alternative. They offer a way of breaking that cycle. And the point being is that, so therefore you can target the Hamas fighters today. Do you actually, by doing that, generate a new set of Hamas fighters for the next generation who have seen the carnage that's being wreaked? So it's a really difficult, ideally from a military perspective, you want to separate Hamas from its supporters, which is actually Iran, probably. But the harsh reality of this is back in 2006, Hamas was elected into power. They have a political wing and a military wing, but they've never gone in front of the ballot box again. And I do wonder whether Hamas, as a result of what it's done on the 7th of October, truly represents the will of the Palestinian people. I can't believe that families, women, children on both sides want this conflict to continue. Surely they actually want to peacefully coexist. In this country, Jews, Islam, all sorts of religious faiths live quite happily together. We share a set of values. In fact, many of the marches that have been happening, pro-Palestinian marches in London, have been supported by the Jewish community. They don't see this as a religious fight. It's about tolerance. It's about living together. And the true cost of this conflict is humanity. It's not sparked by Hamas and the Israelis, but it won't be solved militarily.
So, Sean, the casualties are rising. What I perceive is that world opinion is actually shifting. Netanyahu seems convinced he's going to carry this through. Is that actually being evidenced by what's happening on the ground, and what's the strategy?
Yeah, it's a great series of questions, isn't it? First of all, I would say, as a military guy, it's very difficult to see how there's a military solution to this. So let's put that one on the table before we start. But what Israel now seems to be doing, the ground offensive is clearly underway. First phase of that, which we sort of anticipated, is armour, going in and clearing the ground and putting a circle around Gaza City. Now, whilst Gaza is fiercely, heavily populated, there are still big areas of rural land with small populations living there. And that seems to be the priority at the moment, clearing those out. Hamas are resisting. They've set traps. They've got anti-tank weapons. They've got all sorts of... They're using the tunnels to pop out and try to ambush the Israeli forces. But the harsh reality is, outside the cities, Israel's military is a pretty formidable capability, and it can bring to bear satellite technology, artillery, tanks, armor. So Hamas are going to be more of an irritation in that phase. But already we heard today, the 2nd of November, that the IDF have now lost 18 soldiers since this offensive started. And that's probably the least dangerous part of this. It's probably also worth noting that the world was worried this would escalate, that Hezbollah would get involved up to the north, coming in. But Hezbollah announced today that they've lost 50 fighters so far. There have been border skirmishes across the border with Lebanon. It's quite a small border. But I think what's most telling about that is Hezbollah actually has a lot of rockets and drones that can actually target the whole of Israel. So far, they've not used them. Now, Lebanon doesn't really want to get involved in this. And despite the threats of Hezbollah, so far, despite the fact that the Israelis are mounting a full offensive, Hezbollah has been a little bit cautious. But going back to the IDF, that first phase, Ring of Steel around, that exploits Israel's military advantage. There's no doubt that they will make their way to the outskirts of the city. The next phase will be the really difficult one, because it's not a place for armor. Urban fighting, it favors the defense rather than the offense. Generally, you get something like 5-to-1 casualties. So 5 times as many casualties when you're attacking as you are defending in an urban environment. And that's before you consider the Gaza metro, that network of tunnels, potentially tens, hundreds of kilometers of tunnels, which Israel won't know where they all are.
And the ratio is about because you have to expose yourself in the fight.
Yeah, I mean, expose yourself is an interesting term, but yes, but militarily, your every window, every door, every street corner, every hatch in the road potentially is booby-trapped, potentially has got a Hamas fighter behind it. They're all prepared, whereas the infantry have to go in relatively exposed, and it's just a really difficult environment.
And do Hamas wear a uniform?
We've seen some video with some footage on, but many of the soldiers or fighters that on the day, if they were fighters on the 7th of October, were not in military uniform at all. So it'd be very difficult to identify
I was going to say
who the bad guys are. And it's also worth pointing out, I mean, it's difficult to make analogies, but if you look at, remember Russia tried to take Bakhmut, and they just tried a grinding war through the middle of the city using convicts for soldiers. But they lost 30,000 soldiers killed just on that one operation because it's just so dangerous. So the Israeli Defense Force, they've committed, they've said it's a war, they've committed to doing it, and they're already taking minor casualties. But it'd be really interesting to see once they get into the thick of the city, this could be horribly brutal.
So at this point, we take questions from viewers, and we've had a good question from Dave. Sean.
Yeah, thanks, Dave, for the question. And it actually resonates with a lot of the themes of some of the other comments we've had, which is now that Prime Minister Netanyahu has declared war on Hamas, how does that influence the prospects for the hostages, which there's now 240 odd hostages. What's the prospects for them? I think what's interesting about the whole hostage situation is Qatar, a third party, has been trying to negotiate the release of hostages. But if you listen carefully, they're only talking about civilian hostages, not the military side. And almost certainly the Israelis are not interested in only releasing the civilians. They want to have their military folks back because they will never leave somebody behind. And therefore, as a result, whilst Hamas is holding them, they're going to have a go at Hamas. They're going to go into the tunnels and they're going to try and liberate them. Now, headlines, Israel has said They want to destroy Hamas, and their other priority is to release the hostages. I have to say, from a military perspective, those two don't quite sit comfortably together, because if you declare war and you do what the IDF are doing at the moment, going in guns blazing, it's very difficult to see how that will enhance the prospects of the safe release of hostages, but we'll have to see.
And is there a way that Hamas actually want to protect the hostages because they are negotiating pawns?
Absolutely. They will want their currency, their tradable currency. And also, I think, in the West, we sort of imagine there'll be a big room with 240 people in there. It won't be like that at all. They'll be scattered around. Hamas is one of the group of fighters. There are other groups. It's quite possible that they are disconnected, that these groups are being held and these hostages are scattered around all over the place. But you're quite right. They will almost certainly want to keep some of the hostages, because even one military hostage will be enormously powerful. And that's exactly one of the military hostages Hamas held for 4 years before they were released. So, yeah, they're going to be protecting some of them.
Thank you.